Welcome to The Explainer, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me today because we are diving deep into one of the most fascinating and, honestly, kind of unsettling aspects of human psychology. It's a little unsettling because it completely challenges our fundamental sense of self. I mean, why do we, as fiercely independent as we all like to think we are, so frequently and willingly surrender to groupthink? Well, today we're going to trace the evolutionary roots of conformity to really figure out the invisible forces that are shaping human behavior behind the scenes.
I want to start off by throwing a pretty stark question your way. Are your thoughts actually yours? It sounds almost a little offensive, doesn't it? We all desperately want to believe that we are the absolute sovereign authors of our own beliefs, our preferences, the media we consume, even our political views. But as we unpack the research today, you are going to see just how deeply our minds are hardwired to prioritize group cohesion over objective truth. It's this incredibly powerful biological drive that quietly compromises our individual autonomy every single day, and most of the time, we don't even notice it happening.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the evolution of the herd to get a handle on the biology. Then, we'll look at unconscious collective conditioning, which is the long-term programming we all go through. Third, we'll explore the cycle of conformity, where those two forces actually collide. Fourth, we'll check out how the digital echo chamber has basically weaponized this. And finally, we'll talk about reclaiming individual autonomy.
Our journey really starts back in the ancestral era. I want you to picture, just for a second, what life was actually like for early humans wandering the savannah. Back then, staying with the tribe wasn't just about having buddies to hang out with. It was literally about avoiding being eaten by predators. You conformed or you died. Moving into the modern era, that survival mechanism didn't just vanish, it morphed. Conformity became all about absorbing complex cultural values just to fit into a massive societal matrix. And finally, the digital age. This is where things get truly wild. This deep, ancient evolutionary programming has now been globally accelerated. The exact same survival instinct that kept your ancestors from being isolated on the plains thousands of years ago is playing out right this very second on your smartphone.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the evolution of the herd, to establish the ancient biological why behind human conformity.
There's this absolutely fascinating contrast right at the heart of our evolutionary psychology. Rooted super deeply in our biology, herd mentality is just our innate tendency to mimic the actions and beliefs of a larger group. Like I mentioned, in that ancestral environment, isolation meant total vulnerability to the elements and to predators. But here is the kicker. That evolutionary blueprint is still fully hardwired into our modern brains. When we find ourselves in a crowd today, this rapid psychological shift happens. Psychologists actually call it a diffusion of personal responsibility. Think about it. Have you ever walked down a busy city street and seen a group of, say, 5 strangers, all stopped, craning their necks to stare up at the sky? What did you do? You almost certainly looked up too, right? And you did it without even consciously deciding to. In that split second, the ancient biological desire to align with the group completely overrides your individual critical evaluation of the situation.
And because that critical evaluation gets bypassed so easily, we see some truly fascinating and honestly sometimes dangerous modern manifestations of this. When the primal brain takes the wheel, the results can be entirely harmless, like a goofy fashion fad where suddenly everyone decides chunky neon sneakers are the absolute peak of style, but it can also be highly destructive. This exact same diffused responsibility is the mechanism behind dangerous mass hysteria and totally irrational financial bubbles. Just look at tulip mania in the 1600s. Perfectly rational people were literally trading their life savings for a single flower bulb just because everyone else was doing it, or even modern mob violence. It is the acute, immediate manifestation of group conformity completely hijacking the rational mind.
But herd mentality is really just the acute reaction. Let's move on to Part 2, unconscious collective conditioning. This is the long-term societal programming that shapes us long before a physical crowd ever forms.
So by definition, unconscious collective conditioning is the lifelong process through which individuals absorb the values, biases, and behavioral expectations of their culture entirely without active awareness. Why does it matter so much that this happens below the surface? Because if you don't know what's happening, it's almost impossible to defend against. It quietly embeds itself right into our collective unconscious, shaping these unseen boundaries of what we consider to be normal, right, or undeniably true.
We absorb all this conditioning through a pretty omnipresent matrix of influence. Literally from infancy, you and I are immersed in familial traditions, educational systems, religious doctrines, and media narratives. Let's say your family always celebrated a holiday in one very specific way, or your early schooling heavily rewarded you for sitting perfectly still and raising your hand before you spoke. Over time, these constantly reinforced behaviors solidify into a deeply internalized worldview. And because this programming is nearly universal within your specific community, it rarely, if ever, gets questioned. It's just accepted as basic common sense. It becomes the absolute truth of your specific tribe.
Which brings us to a shared realization that is honestly a bit profound. People very often believe they're making entirely independent choices, when in reality, they are completely unaware that their preferences have been meticulously scripted by the society they live in. We love to think we're painting this beautiful, completely unique picture with our lives. But if we're being honest, we're often just coloring inside the lines that this matrix of influence carefully drew for us before we could even speak.
And that brings us to Section 3, the cycle of conformity. What exactly happens when these two massive forces, the long-term conditioning and the acute herd mentality, intersect?
Think of it like this. You have collective conditioning, which is long-term. It acts as the primer. It's constantly running in the background, wiring your brain from childhood to desperately seek validation and approval from your environment. Then you have herd mentality, which is an acute, immediate trigger. Imagine a scenario where a totally new, controversial ideology suddenly captures the public imagination. Your conditioned brain, which is already primed for validation, just automatically aligns with the majority. Why do we do this? Well, we do it to avoid the terrible, very real psychological discomfort of cognitive dissonance and the primal, downright terrifying fear of social exclusion. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle of compliance. The long-term primer makes us incredibly, almost dangerously susceptible to the immediate trigger. And then, this alignment gets supercharged by a psychological trap known as informational social influence. This is the automatic assumption that the surrounding crowd must possess more accurate knowledge than you do. Think about it. If you're sitting in a building and suddenly every single person around you bolts for the exits, you aren't going to sit there and demand to see the fire first. You assume they have to know something you don't, right? And while that is definitely useful in a fire, out in everyday society, avoiding exclusion through this trap leads to a total surrender of personal judgment. You just outsource your critical thinking to the herd, assuming the majority simply cannot be wrong.
Let's transition over to Part 4, the digital echo chamber. How exactly has modern technology hijacked this ancient survival mechanism?
Well, social media platforms basically act as global hyperspeed accelerators for everything we've just been talking about. It goes like this. Step 1. Engagement-optimized algorithms funnel you into digital echo chambers, quietly but continuously conditioning your political and social views by only showing you exactly what you already agree with. Step 2. A narrative goes viral, suddenly capturing the public imagination. Step 3. The pressure to conform hits you instantly, but it doesn't manifest as a physical crowd at your door. It manifests through thousands of likes, shares, and very public callouts. It's a highly engineered conformity pipeline. Think about that visceral, stomach-dropping feeling of seeing someone get targeted by a digital crowd, or worse, being targeted yourself. It forces compliance almost instantly.
The scale of this dynamic in our hyper-connected environment is completely unprecedented. Herd mentality doesn't need physical crowds gathering in a town square anymore. It operates across screens globally in real time. Because human civilization is built on shared beliefs, these digital mechanisms prioritize group cohesion over objective truth on a massive scale. And here's why this matters so deeply to all of us today. Our biological brains literally cannot tell the difference between a digital mob on social media and a physical tribe abandoning us in the ancestral wilderness. To your nervous system, being canceled online feels exactly like an evolutionary death sentence. This fundamentally drives the mass polarization we see in society and the rapid, brutal silencing of any dissenting voices that dare to step outside the boundaries of their digital tribe.
So, knowing all of this, how on earth do we break free from the invisible conductor of social compliance? That brings us to our final section, reclaiming individual autonomy.
While these evolutionary forces definitely provide the social glue we need to maintain order, left unchecked, they're a massive threat to our intellectual freedom and moral agency. To override the programming, we have to take some practical, actionable steps. First, continuous self-reflection. How do you do that? By actively auditing your own beliefs. Stop and ask yourself, do I actually believe this, or do I just want the people around me to applaud me for saying it? Second, you need the genuine willingness to question deeply held assumptions, even the ones that feel like absolute, unquestionable truth in your social circle. Read perspectives you disagree with, not to argue, but to actually understand. And third, you must cultivate the courage to stand apart from the crowd, despite what your ancient biology is screaming at you to do.
There's this really powerful thought from the research that perfectly encapsulates our exploration today. It says only by becoming conscious of the invisible forces that shape us can we truly claim ownership of our own minds. Let that sink in for a second. You simply cannot defeat an enemy you cannot see. By deeply understanding the evolutionary roots of conformity, by seeing the digital algorithms and your own biological wiring for what they truly are, you finally have the power to step out of that matrix of influence.
Which leaves us with one final, absolutely essential question to ponder as we wrap up our explainer today. You know the science now. You know the ancestral biology. You know exactly how the digital world manipulates it to keep you in line. So, do you have the courage to stand apart from the crowd? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating topic with me. Take this knowledge, apply it to your own digital and social life, and I will see you in the next explainer.